All right, everyone, welcome back. Thank you very much for staying with us through day 2 of the Smart Protein Summit. We have had a number of very exciting sessions, and I'm particularly excited about this one as well, because we're going to talk about something that's very dear to us, something that you've seen just now in the previous session. We're going to talk about indigenous crops and particularly creating value for farmers. First, I want to take this opportunity to thank our sponsors once again, AAK, ADM, DuPont, Richcore Life Sciences, Puris, Vega Foods, and Wenger. All of you are doing fantastic work in the alternative protein space, in the smart protein space, and helping to build it from the ground up in places like India. We're very grateful to you for your support for the summit as well. I also want to make a very exciting announcement that the winners of day 1's quiz are Varun Gadodia, Ritika Shankar, and Indra T. You've already received emails from me, and I would encourage everyone to enjoy the quizzes and to interact with each other. You're earning points for these for the leaderboard, which is, by the way, riveting. I'm looking at the leaderboard right now as I'm conducting this session. So thank you so much for participating in that as well. So let's move on to this session about future-proofing the farm gate. And in order to set some context, I'm going to repeat some of what I just said. Of all calories consumed by humans, 70% come from only 15 crops. In fact, over 50% come from just 3, rice, wheat, and maize. These crops and others like soy have helped us sustain human populations and livestock for decades. But at this point, as I just said, we're starting to develop a break in our relationship with our natural ecosystems. And this is the point at which we're thinking about transitioning towards abundance over the next decade. At the same time, farmers are over 50% of India's workforce, and they're over 41% of Indonesia. So this isn't a uniquely Indian situation. India is quite a poster child of this agricultural landscape, but there are agricultural landscapes like it all over the world. Governments have been trying to move these farmers over, as I just said, to more diverse, indigenous, sustainable crops like hemp, millets, pongamia that we just talked about. But you can't build a value chain to nowhere. The best way to accomplish this is to create high value, fast growing markets that are end markets for these products. And in order to do that, you need a lot of support from the entire ecosystem of government, product development, business incentives, trade, et cetera, et cetera. And that's kind of where smart protein comes in, right? So I'm gonna introduce to you 3 experts who are doing fantastic work to advance this ecosystem and to ensure that we are diversifying the supply of raw materials and ingredients for the global plant-based industry, and that we are stewarding the welfare of our farmers as we do it, because it is an intrinsically right and good thing to do, to make sure that everyone has a stake and a say in the future of the food system, especially communities like farmers that have a lot of intrinsic wisdom in them. So I'm going to introduce our 3 panelists now. The first, Baljit Ghotra, is Vice President of the food research, at Archer Daniels Midland, one of the largest food and ingredient companies in the world, ADM, of course, across a wide variety of categories. In his role, Baljit oversees teams of research and science to support ADM strategy and accelerates innovation and growth across proteins, carbohydrates, and lipids, and other specialty ingredients. Baljit has a PhD focused on grain science and technology from the University of Alberta, Canada, where he received distinguished awards and held patents on his research, which was subsequently acquired as well. And before joining ADM in 2016, Baljit has spent over 20 years in research and manufacturing across the food industry. Baljit, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Varun, for the introduction. Pleasure to be here.
There's that motorbike outside my window, by the way, that I said would happen on the first day of the conference. But I'm going to go ahead and introduce Sam Lawrence now. Sam is Director of Policy and Government Relations at Food Frontier, which is an organization we absolutely love. Food Frontier is the think tank and expert advisor on alternative proteins in Australia and New Zealand. Sam focuses on regulatory and policy settings for them and is a specialist in Australian agriculture and international trade. Sam has extensive experience in the food and agribusiness sector throughout Australia, Asia, and the Middle East. He's a former diplomat with the New Zealand government, representing them at various United Nations processes. And interestingly, Sam comes from a dairy farming family, and he has worked at a national and international level for the horticulture and pork industries. And he's built a wealth of experience advising industry groups, government, and companies on a broad range of agri-food matters. Sam, thrilled to have you with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Varun. It's a pleasure to be here, and good evening from Melbourne.
Sam is also joining us past 11 p.m. in Australia. So thank you once again for that. And lastly, we have Siddharth Pide, who's turned panelist from moderator yesterday. So Siddharth is SciTech specialist at GFI India, focused on plant-based foods. He holds a master's degree in food science from Rutgers University in the US and a bachelor's degree in food technology from Osmania University in India. Prior to joining GFI, Siddharth worked as a food scientist at Eat Just Inc., which is a company you should know a little bit about by now from Josh's keynote address yesterday. Uh, Siddharth was a key contributor to formulating and manufacturing the Just Egg, which is made from mung beans, as we discussed. He has also been a part of multiple research and development and food safety internships with General Mills, Rutgers Food Incubation Center, and Nestle in India. At GFI India, Siddharth's role as a science and technology specialist aligns well with his passion to leverage food science to create a nutritious, just, and sustainable food supply. Siddharth, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Varun. It's my pleasure to be here and looking forward to an exciting panel.
Wonderful. Okay, so first we're going to go over a round of questions about what each of you does. Baljeet, you lead some really fascinating work at ADM focused on plant-based proteins and other ingredients. And this is, I think, the most fascinating time in history to be doing this, which is what you and I have discussed earlier as well. The business has, of course, existed for a very long time. But would you please let the audience know a little bit about that history, particularly in proteins, and how you currently work with farmers and across international borders?
Very good. Thank you, Varun. It's a great question as we kick off the discussion. ADM has a rich history in agriculture and food tech space. ADM was founded in 1902. So we have been applying this agri-food technologies for last 118 years, transforming agriculture feedstocks like corn, wheat, soybeans, and a variety of pulses, beans, and other specialty crops, whether it's sorghum and other ancient grains. And we have been transforming these into food, feed, and specialty ingredient solutions. For last 50 years or so, ADM continues to contribute to this fascinating field of plant proteins. And the reason I am saying 50 years is that in 1960, the first texturized vegetable protein was made, and it was made in ADM. And since then, the TVP terminology has been used in the food industry, and that's where it all began. And first meatless burger was made in 1980. And ADM, with its global footprint in agriculture feedstock, from origination to all the way to processing, we have a responsibility that we continue to demonstrate leadership across this supply chain from farm to consumer. And your question, Varun, on farmers, how we work with farmers, and it's a very critical piece, because that's where all begins, right? It's that agriculture. Farmers are our partners in the supply chain. We are always aiming to work alongside to keep sustainability in the forefront while working with them. We are partnering with farmers at regional as well as global levels to implement better agriculture practices and drive positive impact. There are several examples where we are working with farmers, whether it's crop rotation, how to improve the soil nutrient density, how to implement better agriculture practices like regenerative soil practices, crop rotation, as I mentioned. So those play a huge role as we think about how to keep these natural resources intact, because we know that those are not unlimited.
Thank you, Baljeet. Siddharth, if I do say so myself, you're doing some pretty fascinating work with indigenous crops with GFI India, what we're calling our Indigenous Crops Initiative. Could you tell the audience a little bit about that specific work at a high level?
Yeah, sure, Varun. So the goal of GFI India's Indigenous Crops Initiative is to get India's indigenous crops, for example, millets, different types of legumes, into the supply chain for CPG companies to actually make food products from it, and for farmers to generate income from it, and in general, for the ecosystem to have a strong supply chain of these diverse crops. And the way we are approaching it is by generating scientific information along the value chain, right from information on genomics to phenotype to food science functionalities all along the way, which would be useful, for companies as they, develop products from it. One of the first projects that we have as a part of this initiative has been funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and it's focused on evaluating or characterizing varieties of sorghum, pearl millet, and finger millet, for different scientific parameters, with focus right now being on flatbreads and biscuits. Yeah, and we are partnering with ICRISAT in Hyderabad and the Research Institute of Sweden in Sweden for doing this project. Essentially generating data which should be available in the form of an open access database by the end of 2021, which can again be used by companies to make food products. So the goal is essentially to prove a use case for these crops, be it in terms of nutrition, be it in terms of functionality, be it in terms of cost, so that companies and entrepreneurs are motivated to use these crops, and a strong supply chain develops for these crops, and that will also drive income for farmers.
Yeah, thank you, Siddharth. And I should say, even though we have a focus on indigenous crops at GFI India in some of our programmatic work, that isn't to say that we don't believe in the use of soy and etc. Right? So obviously, there is a lot known from a scientific standpoint about soy and other crops like that that are in those dominant groups that we've described earlier. And we think that there's a huge opportunity to diversify the ingredient base, which is why we're doing this. So Sam, I'll move to you now. Food Frontier is doing really wonderful, I mean, truly inspirational work in Australia and New Zealand to advance the alternative protein sector. And you're leading their policy engagement work. What does this entail from a very broad perspective?
Sure. Well, broadly, Food Frontier is a think tank and industry advisor, not entirely dissimilar to GFI's role in India. Our focus mostly is on plant-based meat and cellular agriculture. Although, of course, we get drawn into the conversations around aligned areas such as plant-based dairy products. We're philanthropically funded, which is important to note because that allows us a level of independence in terms of the way that we operate and the way that we're received. We operate over two main strategic pillars. The first is thought leadership, and that includes research, either research that we commission ourselves or that we conduct in-house, education and articles. Some of the research that we have commissioned, for example, by Deloitte Access Economics, modeling the size of the plant-based meat sector on a national economy, on Australia's national economy. I believe that was the first time in the world that that's been done. The purpose of that research was to change, and I can maybe come back to this a bit later in the panel session, was to change the national conversation around alternative proteins from one of a threat to one based on an economic opportunity. So the importance of that fundamental research to framing the narrative around alternative proteins can't be overlooked. The second area that we engage on is industry engagement. That's working with companies and with the broader ecosystem and linking them to services. We also work with government and the agriculture sector, of course, bringing them together and into the conversation, and obviously with research universities and so forth. So I focus mainly on that government and agriculture side of the equation, particularly around that relationships, opportunities, and potential threats to the sector, issues around, as we've seen globally, around plant-based labeling, for example, or cultivated meat regulation.
Sam, I'll stay with you for this next question, because one of the major things that you've done, it's actually been a major announcement, a major development, I would say, not just for the sector in Australia, but globally, is an initiative that you've announced pretty recently called the Future of Protein Forum. Livestock farmers in India are currently a major group whose incomes are susceptible to issues that have nothing to do with alternative proteins, right? Zoonotic diseases, supply chain shocks. For example, farmers in India had to dump thousands of chickens as demand dropped suddenly during COVID-19. And this regularly happens with, we've heard about African swine fever in China, but also avian flu in places like India. We regularly see outbreaks, even during COVID-19, it's happened. Could you tell us a little bit more about the Future of Protein Forum, how you're working with farmers, including livestock farmers, to help them diversify their income streams and to create more resilient, future-proof businesses?
Sure, it's a great question. I'll link back to a thing I said a moment ago around framing the narrative and the importance of that. So part of our role over the last few years has been really taking hold of what was maybe a year or 18 months ago, a conversation that looked at alternative proteins as this emerging thing, potential threats to traditional agriculture, and putting some evidence around it. And so we could have a conversation based on facts and figures rather than on emotion. I think that's the first thing to note here. We've reframed that conversation now in Australia from one of an existential threat to agriculture to one of an economic opportunity, and that's through work like Deloitte Access Economics. That's had an impact on the agriculture sector because it said by 2030, alternative proteins will be a $3 billion opportunity in Australia. That's a big number in anybody's books. That was followed, that research, by several other research pieces, including from within the agriculture sector itself, which came up with broadly similar numbers, around $3.1 billion. The importance there is the voices within the agriculture sector coming up with this information rather than an outside organization like Food Frontier saying, knocking on the door and saying this is an opportunity. That message being received from within their own colleagues is quite powerful. The Future of Protein Forum stems from continued work like that around finding allies. Those members of the broader agriculture ecosystem have educated themselves, have seen the evidence around alternative proteins and recognize the opportunity. They play a really important role because they have to translate that opportunity back to the farmer. And that's a piece that we can come back to. It's important to remember that not all farms are the same. Some farmers are growing crops, some farmers are running livestock, many farmers are doing both. And there will be opportunities greater for one farmer than another. I had a conversation last year with the president of Australia's National Farmers Federation. She has a livestock operation in a state of Australia called New South Wales. She also grows chickpeas. So on the one hand, she looked at it through a livestock lens, but on the other hand, very pragmatically said, I can see the opportunity here with legume crops around alternative proteins and that new value chain that this can present to me as a farmer. So it's important to build those alliances and those relationships with pragmatic and forward-thinking leaders where we can. Alternative proteins are emerging and they do present an enormous opportunity, but there is a big power differential, and we must remember this when engaging with agriculture. Alternative proteins are very small compared to traditional agriculture. We have to also recognize that not all sectors will benefit equally within agriculture, but there is room for everyone. We're having this conversation in a context of a growing global population that will reach 10 billion people by 2050. In an Australian context, 70% of our agricultural produce is exported, and that'll continue to be the case. So alternative proteins are simply another choice for the consumer and another income stream and another supply chain potentially for farmers to supply into. Many of whom who are currently growing legumes actually are exporting to India, the majority of Australia's legume crop. But there is that transitional piece that we do need to explore, which is how do we translate the opportunity presented by alternative proteins back to behind the farm gate? What incentive structures really are needed to run some of those pilot projects and prove the case?
Yeah, thank you, Sam. It's an extremely exciting development. I would argue it's sort of a milestone in the maturation of the industry to see that people in an economy that has so much pride over agriculture, and rightfully so, as Australia does. I would argue this is a major milestone for the entire global industry, as I said. So it's really incredibly exciting. Baljeet, I'm gonna ask you to dive a little bit further into the work that you mentioned. We heard a little bit about the history of ADM and how, excitingly enough, the TVP first came from ADM, perhaps. I'm gonna ask you to dive a little bit deeper. A major question that many people have is whether utilizing these biodiverse crops, all the things I'm saying right now, can they actually lead to better plant-based foods? Is that true or not? Could you tell us a little bit more about why diverse raw materials and ingredients are a good thing? So we're not entirely reliant on one crop or even three crops, and why we kind of need to create this biodiversity.
Right. No, I think it's a great question, Varun. We all know this, that we are what we eat, and consumers have already taken a lead role on that. They are aware of what they are putting in their body, and they know what is going to be healthy for them, but they're also relating it to what's good for the health of the planet. So this is diverse ingredients and raw materials is inevitable in my view, and that is because um, we need to bring solutions to this diverse consumer market, and they have set the stage already, as we have seen in last several years. 50% of the consumers are are reported to be turning flexitarian. Now, flexitarian means they're not saying eliminate meat, but they're switching to plant-based foods. This is leading to diversification of diets. They are looking at alternate sources of proteins as they switch to alternates to meat or dairy and milk products. So consumers are aware that that they need a wider choice, and food industry has a role to play here. So there's an urgency of new and a better sustainable food systems, in my view. ADM offers a wide range of ingredients that comes from different feedstocks, agriculture feedstocks. There are over 40 plus seeds and grains that ADM currently processes. It includes beans, pulses, soy proteins, where ADM has a global footprint. And recently, pea proteins is a new processing plant we started in North Dakota. So ADM continuously is innovating on how we can process these newer agriculture feedstocks like peas, and how we incorporate these into foods and beverages so that they not only taste delicious, but they're nutritious also. In addition to that, I would also like to point out, which Varun you mentioned before, on grains, which are pulses, beans, soybeans are definitely going to play a major role as we think about providing proteins to to growing population on Earth. As Sam mentioned, there's going to be 10 billion people by 2050. So how to bring more protein on the table as we think about feeding the population sustainably. ADM also offers ancient grain solutions, like we think about buckwheat, millets, and particularly sorghum. These are the crops which we know that with the climate change and all the climate issues happening, what we saw in 2020 already with the pandemic issues, I mean, we need to look at these alternate crops that can be grown into arid and semi-arid environments, so that we are not relying on exporting or importing, in certain situations to feed the population. How to enable the regional farmers so that they can maximize the use of land that they have, and sorghum is a very, very interesting crop in that regard.
Yeah, I agree. I actually want to respond to a couple of things before I move on to Siddharth and ask him a question. Sam, I think you mentioned that basically a lot of this, the narrative has changed to a certain degree, or it is maturing and changing towards one of opportunity. So if someone is farming livestock, they're also farming chickpeas, so they see that opportunity as well. And Baljit, you mentioned that a lot of this is also led by consumers, which is why farmers are smart people. They see that there's a consumer trend as well, and so there's an opportunity for a diversified income stream. I think these are kind of tectonic shifts that are happening, and people have to respond to them. So if they see the opportunity, I think we're going to see a lot more of this kind of thing moving forward. There is another tectonic shift that's underway as a result of COVID-19, right? Which is sort of governments becoming slightly more insular and wanting to localize food supply in response to supply chains being threatened by things like COVID-19 in the future. So a lot of governments, including the Indian government, has focused on self-sufficiency as a narrative moving forward, what they're calling the Atmanirbhar Bharat. So whether it's increasing the yield of crops locally, increasing the variety of crops locally, or increasing processing locally, this is going to happen. Farmers need to think about getting involved in these industries of the future, and there'll be a lot of consumer demand as well as government incentives for it moving forward, I think. Siddharth, I want to ask you a question about something similar to what Baljit just said. As a food scientist, more recently an educator as well in some universities in Israel as part of the work that GFI Israel is doing, our partners in Israel, you're very well placed to educate our audience here. Baljit just told us why biodiversity is important from a consumer standpoint. Uh, we've also worked with entrepreneurs, large corporations, to help them understand how they can realize the tremendous value from a scientific standpoint in our diverse crops. Could you explain to the audience in layperson terms what are some of the opportunities to experiment with and optimize and utilize various crops in plant-based meat, eggs, and dairy, and the kinds of scientific things that you would kind of think about from there?
Yeah, thank you, Varun. Very relevant question. So at GFI, we usually view any R&D from three lenses, right? We start off with crop optimization. How can you create better crops, or how can you optimize the crops so that they are more applicable to plant-based meat and dairy products? And then there is raw material optimization. So how do you extract proteins from these crops such that the yield is high, they are still functional, the organoleptic properties are still good and can be used in meat and dairy products. And in the end, there is formulation. So just talking about it a little more, there's a lot of work going on in academia and in industry around optimizing crops so that they could be more applicable to plant-based meat and dairy products. For example, the company Benson Hill is actually making soybeans which have a high protein content. So what happens is, you don't need to go through the protein extraction and concentration stages, and essentially a lot of costs are saved, which typically you spend in the downstream processing. There's also Equinom, a company based in Israel, which is developing crops which have super traits of nutrition, functionality, etc. So this is on optimizing the crops which are already out there in the market. But then, as Baljit was also mentioning, there is a need to diversify these crops, and there is a lot of work going on that too. So even the GFI, like the Good Food Institute's research grant program, we have funded projects across the globe wherein researchers are trying to understand and study new crops, for their protein, for their amino acid profile, for their functionalities, etc. And that's great. And just mentioning something which Josh Tetrick from Just mentioned yesterday, that for thousands of years the functionality of an egg was locked in a mung bean, but it's just because in the last few years that just decided to study the mung bean, extract specific proteins, which gel that, this crop has come into prominence. And there could be a lot more crops like this, which would have special functionalities, which could be used in meat and dairy products. So that is one aspect of it. Another area of research is how do I extract the proteins from these crops so that they are functional. Now you could go with filtration method, or you could go with the pH solubility method, and each of these processes and the parameters that you use within these processes are going to give you proteins which have different functionalities. So a lot of research is going on around the globe to kind of optimize these extraction processes. And in the end, it comes down to food science. Once you have these different diverse set of ingredients, how do you mix them together? How do you texturize them in the right way to get your final product? So there is a lot of research going on. It's a very interesting area of research, and yeah, very exciting time to be here.
Thank you, Siddharth. Sam, a lot of what Siddharth just described actually happens initially by government funding, right? So there's, Beyond Meat came to be because there was a lot of research ongoing at the universities of Missouri and Saskatchewan, places like that, on pea protein and how it had functionality that could be utilized for meat replacements and things like that. So governments all over the world are supporting this kind of research, governments and university ecosystems. We heard from Dr. Renu Swarup earlier today, for example, and the Department of Biotechnology in India has identified plant genetics as an area that they might focus on over the next several years. So based on your dealings with the Australian and New Zealand governments, I would imagine that there is a lot of agricultural funding, even if it's very early in the value chain, basic agricultural research funding. What would you say are the most promising developments in this area that we can leverage in the alternative protein space?
Sure. Well, there's a variety of activity in R&D happening in Australia and in New Zealand. First, let me tackle the structure of the R&D system. Australia is lucky in that it's a rich R&D system. There are a series of levy-funded research and development corporations, so paid for in combination with a levy charged to usually the grower at the first point of sale, and that is matched to up to a certain value with federal government funds. And there's a research and development corporation for each sector, so one for dairy, one for red meat, one for grains, one for horticulture, and so on. In addition to that, of course, there's the R&D conducted by universities, often in combination with industry, as is the same in India, and often supported by state governments. And in Queensland, for example, one of the states of Australia, we're seeing a focus on fermentation, which is really interesting to see emerging. Then we have our National Science Agency, the CSIRO, and they have a series of missions, they call them, areas of focus really. And one of those is a future protein mission. Now they're currently looking at what that will contain. It's looking at all forms of protein, but there will be, it appears, a reasonably strong focus on alternative proteins. So that's a federal government funded research initiative. In addition to that, there are research question-specific organizations set up. They're called cooperative research centers. And specific to the alternative protein space, we've seen a bid for the setup of one of these research centers called the Pulse Protein CRC. So it's focusing on legume crops and some pretty fundamental research right through from genomics all the way through to marketing and policy related research. One of the interesting questions I'm hoping that they will tackle, for example, is consumer demand in both Australia and our export markets. That consumer demand hasn't been analysed or quantified yet, and I'm hoping that that will then inform varieties and quantities. Secondly, the nature of the research questions, particularly questions around native varieties. I'm really interested in this conversation. It's a conversation Australia's just started to have in the context of alternative proteins. There really is significant scope to explore this in Australia. Most plant-based products, as you know, are made with soy and pea protein, which are not very well suited to Australian growing conditions. We're a large, dry continent with not very much water. Cellular agriculture, there's some really interesting research happening there. There are some moves to look at the establishment potentially of a collaborative cellular agriculture research center, and whether that looks like a diffused, dispersed project of research and centrally coordinated, or an actual center. Don't know yet, but those are ongoing conversations. There's certainly a role for government in response to your question, in sort of leading that blue sky thinking, that almost greater good research effort, and providing the resources for it. And we're starting to see the coalescence in certain areas, particularly with federal government funding of some programs to explore some of those questions.
And of course, Food Frontier has been at the center of all of those efforts to a great degree, and that's really fantastic stuff, Sam. Well, you're about to be modest, but I'll just say that. I'll just leave it there. What's really exciting to me also, I think, is you mentioned CSIRO, or CSIRO as it's sometimes known. There was actually a company that was launched out of CSIRO, right, called V2 Food, where they did actually a research for equity arrangement. I think that's really fascinating that the premier scientific research institute, or the organization from the government of Australia, is supporting this kind of entrepreneurship and bringing companies to market.
They have an investment arm as well called Main Sequence Ventures, I believe, and they partnered with industry to create V2 Food, as you mentioned. And V2 Food is providing their products already into food service and in retail. I think they launched a week or 2 weeks ago. I bought some of their plant-based mints, very good. And they partnered with the owner of, you'll be familiar with the international brand Burger King. The owner of that franchise in Australia partnered with Main Sequence Ventures and formed V2 Food.
Yeah, very, very cool. And we're looking forward to similar developments in India, but also getting some V2 Food meats in India as well. Baljit, we've talked a lot about the potential of plant-based foods to utilize these indigenous crops and also the traditional crops that we already have that are widely spread across the food system, and the science behind unlocking their potential. But much of this has to be driven at the farm level and at the ag value chain level, right? So we need a reliable supply of these crops, these raw materials, including sometimes very specialized varieties. So Siddharth talked about Eat Just's mung beans. They are working with specific varieties of mung beans that are optimized or bred in ways that allow them to have the best functionality for an egg, right? So what are the barriers for companies, especially large corporations, to work directly with farmers to make this kind of thing a reality, a sort of farm to fork value chain?
Right. No, great question, Varun. And the reason is, we need to think about that very critically now, because food security has never been more important than what it is today. And we all know that we need to not only bring diversity of crops, but we also need to produce significantly more food from significantly less land, as you think about demographic shifts are happening. So in my view, technology and innovation is the only way for us to continue to push the boundaries as we think about um, agriculture feedstocks, as we think about processing, as Siddharth mentioned about these newer varieties that bring unique functionality. Sam mentioned about large area, landscape, you know, in Australia are not suitable for growing peas, for example, or soybeans. So, I mean, how we can apply biotechnology, how we can apply these new agriculture practices where we prevent the desertification of cultivable land. In my view, technology and innovation will break the barriers, and a little bit of that already started to happen as we all have seen the startup activities, and we have seen about $20 billion of investment in disruptive technologies and alternative proteins. And ADM, we um, we connect this whole supply chain, as I was mentioning before. I mean, we have um, we are working in the farms, partnering with the farmers, but we are along the supply chain. There's a processing aspect, bringing the food that is delicious and nutritious all the way to the consumer. So ADM is playing a critical role in uniting the supply chain. So we do also see a responsibility that we have, how we turn these challenges into opportunities along the supply chain. And that we talked about, I heard earlier, talked about funding, how to enable these disruptive technologies, the blue sky technologies or research um, that will help us solve those challenges. And I think we see that it's not only just corporations, we see NGOs, thought leaders, institutes like Good Food Institute, and we see academia, um, regulatory agencies. They all need to come together to really help solve these challenges. And we have seen climate issues. What we're seeing, and how it's going to affect crops if in next 20, 30 years. Research is already showing what we need to overcome, how to maximize the yield if the temperatures are increasing in certain parts of the geographical regions. So there's a tremendous work needs to happen, and urgency has increased because as we think about sustainable food systems, um, the natural resources are not unlimited. So we need to enable these like-minded individuals from this variety of organizations so that they all work alongside each other. And I think that will be essential to break the barriers as we think about diversifying our food value chain with this variety of grains that will help us not only produce food that are tasty but also nutritious.
Yeah, thank you, Baljit. So, Siddharth, staying with that theme of collaboration across different actors like academia, startups, etc., and also I think tying it into the idea of driving income to farmers. One of the questions we've grappled with during our own work for the Indigenous Crops Initiative we've undertaken is trying to stimulate those collaborations and dealing with different timelines, different incentives among academia and entrepreneurs, and then also trying to tie that back to farmers as well. You need to kind of make sure that expectations are aligned to get the best out of this kind of collaborative work, right? So could you tell us a little bit about the advantages and disadvantages of working with each of these types of groups and how to kind of set incentives and structures that make sense here?
Yeah, sure, Varun. So, I'd like to start off with academia, industry, and then kind of tie it together. So, talking about academia, as we have noticed in our Indigenous Crops Initiative, there are different agricultural universities in India, spread across in India, who have specialized knowledge about crops growing in that region. And these universities are doing phenomenal work in terms of characterizing these crops and developing these crops further. The primary focus being yield most of the times for the farmers and also taste. And usually these universities are working with farmers to breed these crops and kind of understanding how they are performing on field, then again utilizing this data back and then again making some improvements. So as I was mentioning earlier, so yield is one thing, and second thing is also taste, because a lot of farming in India is subsistence farming. So a majority of output or harvest from the farmers is actually not sold outside in some areas, but rather used by the farmers for the family need for the rest of the season. So the incentive over here with academia is mostly around how to, firstly answering questions which are academically interesting, but in addition to that, working with farmers to for yield, to plant crops with higher yield and for better taste. Now, when it comes to industry, industry I would say has definitely benefited from the decades of agricultural research that has been going on, and even the varieties of crops that industry is able to use. They have been optimized for yield and the costs are down, and that's why they were able to use that. But when it comes to their utilization in novel products like alternative meat, eggs, and dairy, the crops may not have been optimized for that per se. So I think there is a very good opportunity over here for both academia and industry. So academia probably to set up an industry cell in the universities to understand what does the industry really want, and then translating it to how can farmers contribute or how can we contribute, and addressing the needs of all types of stakeholders. And industry can understand what are the short term needs for them, what are the long term needs for them, and work with academia accordingly to benefit the entire ecosystem. And farmers are going to benefit from this sort of collaboration, especially when it comes to alternative meat and dairy products, because these products are typically like high value products, and so the economic gains for the farmers would also be higher for these products. So a lot of opportunities over here.
Yeah, and we've seen all of that happening. These universities have decades of institutional knowledge. Sometimes what happens is it's sitting on a shelf, unfortunately, and we need to help connect that. And also, they have the connections to farmers that entrepreneurs simply do not have, and to get a reliable supply, etc. We'll get to that a little bit later. But Baljit, a lot of that advice is actually applied to entrepreneurs, right? The equation is very different for large corporations because corporations like ADM, we've seen, in fact, corporations in India, it's kind of a spectrum. Some of them are very comfortable saying they'll build an agricultural supply chain and work with Indian farmers. Some, especially multinationals, are reluctant to get involved on that side of things. How would you say that large corporations and entrepreneurs kind of differ in terms of what you bring to the innovation landscape and farmer welfare? And how are you working to collaborate with startups, given that there are differences in what you bring to the table?
Right. No, I think it's a great question, and a shift has started to happen where the large corporations like ADM and others, we are seeing how startups are leveraging the needs of the consumer, and the ADM is working with several of these startups that have come. That are leveraging these new technologies, whether it's a fermentation based or culture, cell culture based and plant agriculture based technologies. And I think the major role here in terms of the corporations, how we see this is we we need to bring like-minded people together to talk about the challenges and solutions and turn these conversations into reality. And I think that can happen when we think about a new product or a new technology that we need to bring all the way to the consumer. There is a supply chain, and how we will incentivize farmers, for example, if we are talking about a new or an improved crop that Siddharth was mentioning, there are crops and grains and seeds. What we are using today in industry are um, are suitable for food and beverage manufacturing as we are doing today. As we think about the next disruption, what is needed for next 10, 20, 30 years, we are starting to think how to do that sustainably. So that means what can be fixed in the crop or the at the seed level that we must do. For this, we need to bring together biotechnologists, engineers, crop scientists, alongside the food scientists. So it's not only just about making food tasty and nutritious, but it's also about how to improve those seeds, how to improve those grains. And I think that's the area where ADM has partnered with farmers, whether it's about sustainable practices or whether it's about crop rotation, improving yields. I heard earlier one of the discussion was on as we bring new crops or varieties, um, the yields may not be there. How a farmer would be incentivized, right? Because if a agriculture land is producing less of the newer variety of crop, so then how to incentivize that? So I think a lot of um, role there has to be played by the regional governments and the NGOs, so that they can at least help to kickstart that innovation, because the value is with the consumer. And with these corporations, how we see we can turn that crop into a unique functionality, for example, but how to bring that value back to the farmer so that innovation can begin. And I think it's a huge challenge, but I think I see some of the shift has started to happen already.
Yeah, thank you for that, Baljeet. Siddharth, just very quickly in a couple of minutes, because I want to preserve some time for questions at the end of the panel. Um, some of this is dependent on the implementation of a value chain, right? And there are complications that arise there. So Baljeet just mentioned, we need to translate what's happening at the end of the value chain that's market oriented back to the farmers and ensure that there's benefit that's happening there as well. But you've seen firsthand how some of the complications in the value chain occur and how they can be a nightmare for food formulators. Could you talk a little bit to your experiences of like sourcing millets, for example, for our experiments?
Yeah, Varun. So okay, so let me start off, right? So when we started our project in the Indigenous Crops Initiative, the goal was, okay, let's procure three varieties of sorghum, three varieties of pearl millet, and three varieties of finger millet, and let's characterize them from a genomics perspective, understand their phenotypes, do experiments on them to understand, different properties of flour to dough to final product. And initially, we thought of purchasing these seeds from, the seed companies out there, where a lot of entrepreneurs would go about it that way too, right? But then we figured out that the seeds which are readily available in the market are not pure in terms of genetic purity, because the way they have been mixed by aggregators is that, okay, there are 5 or 6 different varieties of millets, and they are just mixed together by color, so yellow versus white, and the properties of each variety differs then. And then, if I'm a formulator and I'm trying to make a product and I have a certain XYZ formulation, which, I'm like, okay, this is working fine. And now I go to a food manufacturing facility and I procure like 200, 300 kgs of these different millets. I won't get the similar final product, because the percentages of these different millet varieties and that millet what I'm procuring is going to be different, or millet flour what I'm procuring is different. So that's a challenge right there, right? So the way we approached it is, again, we have been working with ICRISAT on this, is going back to agricultural universities who actually work with farmers and, getting seeds which have high genetic purity, and then determining and doing all our experiments on that, so that we know that these experiments are repeatable. So that's a challenge, right? That's a simple challenge, what I'm saying, that can be addressed. And secondly, I've also interacted with farmers, trying to tell them about the domain of alternative proteins, and how it could be a high value initiative for them too. And as I was mentioning earlier, a lot of farmers, the farming, what they do is subsistence farming. So either entrepreneurs or corporations or someone needs to guarantee them that all their harvest is going to be used by these companies, and they are going to get the price what they need for it. Or we need to make sure that these crops, what the farmers grow, they can be utilized not only in novel products like plant-based meat, egg, dairy, but also for their own use. And this use could vary from region to region, right? In Karnataka, the food products what farmers make from it would be different than in Maharashtra, than in Tamil Nadu, than in northern India. So this is a challenge too. So how to incentivize farmers, and this is what Baljeet also adhered to earlier. So these are the challenges, but as Baljeet mentioned earlier, there is a tectonic shift happening. A lot of initiatives are being put forward, and as Dr. Renu Swaroop also mentioned earlier, there are a lot of initiatives by the government of India to like the Kisan hubs. Now, this is more on the biotech side, but something similar could be done even on the food tech side, plant breeding side. And different types of research can be done, right from fundamental to translational to technology development to commercialize the products, and complete the value chain from end to end.
Yeah, I really want to stress that beginning piece of the value chain needs to be kind of optimized and pulled into these new industries, whether it is alternative protein foods like plant-based meat, or even if it is the kind of stuff that will also emerge from our project with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, like flatbreads and other things, right? The sourcing of those millets, I remember, gave both Siddharth and I a lot of anxiety, because we went in and we asked for a specific varietal of finger millet, and they said, yeah, we have red finger millets, we have yellow finger millets, we have white. Like it was just completely difficult to work with that, right? So I think connecting these two pieces of food formulation with the early part of the agricultural value chain is key to driving income and value back to that early part of the value chain with farmers as well. Sam, I want to give you the last word before we throw to questions from the audience. We've talked about research funding from government. We've talked about all the exciting work that you're doing. There's also a bunch of other things that governments can and should be doing to support alternative proteins. For example, what would the Future of Protein Forum, as it gets formalized more and more, what kinds of requests would it be making from governments? What would you say is the broad swath of things that governments can do to support this area?
Sure. Well, I think governments will always be guided by a few factors. Chief amongst them probably is jobs. So it'll be the evidence that points in that direction is always going to be swaying their decisions. Certainly, we've drawn attention to gaps in the supply chain. For example, in Australia, there's a dearth of processing and fractionation capacity. The first plant of its kind has only just come online in Australia, and the modelling that we've undertaken with Deloitte shows that we need 169,000 tonnes worth of processing capacity by 2030 in this first plant. When it's at full capacity, we'll only be able to produce 6,000 tonnes. So there is a big gap in terms of capability. Government has a lead role in a whole range of areas, including incentives for manufacturing. And something both Siddharth and Baljeet have been talking about is incentives for trials of crops, which I think is really important. Funding for collaborative efforts like the CRC research that I indicated before. Government has a role to play there in leveraging private funds around research against Commonwealth or federal government dollars to grow the overall size of the research pot. The role, I think, for government it's been mentioned a few times here around trials and reducing the risk for farmers, I think is really essential. Reducing the risk for them to participate in trials. One example of a project underway at the moment, although it's funded privately, is to develop a soy supply chain in Australia. And one company is working with sugarcane growers in a state of Australia called Queensland to plant soy as a rotational crop between sugarcane. That will allow them to develop a fully Australian supply chain from the crop that's grown to their own manufacturing and processing capacity, which they're building now, right through to the manufacturing of the final product. That allows them to tell the provenance story of fully Australian grown and produced, for example. In Cell Ag, it's about really supporting research and startups to build an ecosystem and those ancillary services, which are often overlooked. And in an Australian capacity, for example, visa processes for individuals with skills relevant to developing the sector. That's really important, and the movement of professionals through to training in fields of relevance, like tissue culture, for example. The question I think governments should be asking is, well, we have the brains, we have the intellectual capacity to be a leader in this space. The technology is here. The rest of the world is going to be exploring this as well. Do we want to lead this wave, or do we want to be a follower? It's happening globally either way, and those economies that take a lead now, I think, will benefit.
Yeah, I think that's very well said, Sam. I just want to throw to one question from the Slido before we break. Could you throw up just one question, please, from the audience? Pratik, could you throw up one question from the Slido? Yeah, there we go. So very interesting. Yeah, why don't we just take it through the case study of one young farmer setting up a profitable and self-sustaining business model. Sam, do you have a 1-minute answer to this question? Let's say, for example, just one farmer is looking to plug into this new landscape, either through the Future of Protein Forum or elsewhere. Do you have a 1-minute answer to this question?
Sure. I would be having conversations with the farmer representative groups. In an Australian context, for example, there are state farmer representative groups, and they have we've been having conversations with them in an ongoing capacity, and together we're collectively trying to determine what are those next steps. How do we translate the opportunity that we know is going to be in Australia a $3 billion opportunity in a plant-based context, for example, back behind the farm gate? How do we translate that opportunity on farm? Those conversations are happening with farmer representative groups that are forward-thinking and progressive, and with organizations like Good Food Institute or Food Frontier, for example. So I would be, and if those conversations aren't happening with the farmer representative groups, I would be asking for them to be facilitating those conversations.
Thank you. That's very well said as well. And if you are interested in getting involved in this space from an agri standpoint, please talk to us. We think those conversations should be happening as well. I won't sugarcoat it. It's very early in this ecosystem, but there's a huge opportunity here to be involved and shape the future of food. So thank you so much, Baljeet, Siddharth, and Sam. It's been a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much to all of you. I'm not gonna keep anyone any longer. I just want to say that we have a really interesting session coming up right after this on consumer insights for the Indian population and demand for alternative proteins, particularly plant-based meat. So everyone stick around, and thank you so much once again to our panel here today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Varun.
Thank you, Varun.